to get certified in it. So there are a lot of repetitive tasks that businesses do every day. That is from onboarding new employees to sending out invoices and sales orders to even, let's say automating email responses. So there's a lot of repetitive things that go on every day that we can automate pretty easily. Oh, and I see a question. What's the assumed background knowledge needed? Okay, so if you are here, then that means you have some kind of interest in robotic process automation development. It means that you need some kind of background with coding concepts. You don't necessarily need to be a developer to understand what we'll be doing. But if you know things like if-else statements, for loops, how variables are defined, things like that, those are some of the real background pieces that'll make this a lot easier to follow along with. And if you have used UiPath before in any context at all, you don't have to be an expert at it. Maybe you just opened it up to poke around a little bit. But if you've seen the interface, that is also a little bit of good background knowledge to have. And one important thing, you actually need a Windows machine to use UiPath. So if you're working on a Mac or Linux, you probably need to install some kind of virtual machine. So UiPath is actually Windows specific, just in case you didn't know that part. Were there any other questions right now? And hopefully that answered your question on the background knowledge we need. All right. Like I said, feel free to just drop questions in at any time. But this is why RPA exists. There's a bunch of repetitive tasks that need to be done every day, and we can use software bots to automate a lot of that. So, for example, a normal automation task might be opening an email, downloading an attachment, extracting some values from that attachment, and adding them to an Excel sheet. That's a process that can definitely be automated pretty easily because there's no complex steps in that. So what robotic process automation, or RPA, does, it interfaces with different programs to automate these tasks. So with RPA, you can create a bot that will open up an email account, look for something in the inbox based on the subject or the sender, and get that attachment, and then open the attachment in, Word or Excel or whatever format it's in, get the values that it needs out of there, and then it can open up Excel or even a web form to put those values in. So RPA is just one of the ways that we take these processes and chain them together automatically through all of these different programs. And it mimics the behavior of a user doing it. So this is where some of that development might get a little interesting, because we're not writing like Python scripts or anything like that. We're actually telling this bot to open Excel, select however many cells and columns and rows we need, and then copy and paste that into some other spreadsheet or into some other program. So it's actually running through and clicking buttons exactly like a user would. It's not something that's like super programmatic and happening through APIs. UiPath handles all of that underneath the surface. But what we do as RPA developers in UiPath, it's very much us following along with what a user does. So we're responsible for writing the code that automates these tasks. So the reason I used air quotes is because we're not really writing code. We're using the UiPath Studio software to build bots using coding principles. So you don't need to know any programming language. This is very graphical to work with. Again, and we'll go over some of this, of course, but we really just need to know like some of those code concepts. How do you get a variable from a certain Excel sheet? How do you do some type of comparison to see if a value is above a certain threshold? How do you check if you're selecting the value from the right place in a web form or something? That's the type of code that RPA developers are responsible for. So once we get into Studio, which won't be too much longer now, you'll get to see what it actually means to write code. And there are a number of approaches to RPA development. We'll be working with UiPath because it's more of an industry standard, but you can also do a little bit of prototyping with Python if you do happen to know how to code. So you can write some Python scripts that interact with a number of different softwares, and it can do the same thing that UiPath does. It just takes more of that programming knowledge and more of that technical background versus using a tool like UiPath where you can really just jump in and start clicking things. So while there are more programmatic approaches, it doesn't necessarily mean they're the better approaches. And something else very important. When you're working with RPA, you need a well-defined business process, because without that definition, you won't know what to automate. And you also have to take into account what the process is. So when you're talking to project managers and other stakeholders that might be performing these tasks every day, you'll find out whether or not this is even a good candidate for automation. So when you as the RPA developer are brought into this process, make sure that you have a well-defined business process to start automating. So let's talk about how RPA is useful for these business processes and which processes they can be used for. So a business process is a set of interrelated activities that takes some input and transforms it into some output. So going back to our very simple example, that can be opening an email, downloading an attachment, taking values out of that attachment, and putting them in some other software or format. So that would be a business process. And then we have processes that are made into procedures. So us getting the attachment from the email and getting those values to, let's say, some web application, that could just be one small part of the whole procedure of, say, onboarding a new employee or something. You get the information from them through the email, but once it's in that web app, it can trigger a number of other processes to run. Maybe they need to be added to the Slack channel. Maybe they need to have some other emails go out to get more information for them as they're onboarding. But that's kind of how these things build together. So a process is kind of like an individual block, and a procedure is made up of those blocks of processes. So businesses use these processes and procedures to execute tasks in a controlled manner, and that just means we know exactly what's happening at each chunk in our procedure. We know when certain steps should be executed. We know the types of data we're looking for or the values that we need to execute another step. So it takes a lot of the variability out of these processes, because now instead of, let's say somebody's just having a bad day and they skip a step or they forget to put a value in a specific place, now nobody has to worry about that, because these procedures and processes get run the exact same way every time. So this is an example of what a process might look like. We have these different steps in onboarding an employee. So HR will get an email when an employee uploads their forms. They'll take values from certain fields and put them in the business database, and on and on. You can see how this process has 5 different steps to it. So this is just an example of a very, very simple process. When we walk through this with the stakeholders and our project managers, you'll see where more of the details start to come out. So something that we might add to this would be explicitly stating what type of form to expect. Is it going to be a Google form? Are we looking for a PDF, an image, some other format of data? That's where we would get very, very nitpicky, because we need those details as we're making this automation. So don't ever be afraid to ask questions. Always ask questions. Get more detail, because when you're in the middle of building an RPA bot, you will want as much detail as you can possibly have. So this is what the process might look like. So this would be a process definition document. That's one of the terms that you'll hear used in RPA a lot. Process definition documentation, or PDD. So the counterpart to that is the object model diagram. This is the exact same thing that we saw in our PDD in the previous slide, but it's in more of a diagram flow. So you can see where certain decision points are. You can see what happens when we need to branch out on those different decision paths, and you can see where the process starts and ends. So a lot of teams will work very closely together on these documents, so that when you as the RPA developer are finally given this documentation, everything has been really, really thought out, really well defined, and you have all the information you need to get started. But as you read through these documents, your process definition document and your object model diagram, just really, really make sure that you know everything you need. Like, what are the data types that you'll need for different fields? What programs need to be involved? How often does this process get run? So while the team will do a really good job of getting you a well-defined document and flow, just always go back through it and make sure it does have everything you need. And that gets into checking if a process is even fit for automation. Many times the project managers and maybe the business side will think everything can be automated. And as a developer, you know that that's not true. Some things really are just complex enough to where we can't automate them. So when you are going through these documents and talking to people, make sure you determine if that process can be automated. And we do that with 2 things. And again, these are actually questions that came up on the test. So the first thing you'll check for is process fitness. Is it something that can be automated? So is there a well-defined process document behind it? Are there certain values that you know are going to be present every time? Is it consistent? That's basically what you're looking for in this process fitness. Are there consistent steps that you can take every time to make sure that this process executes the exact same way? And then you have automation complexity. If you are working with, maybe 3-4 different tools, it's not that bad. It might take a while to build out the automation, but it's not a complex one. But when you have automation that needs values to be in specific programs and different formats before it can trigger the next step, which will pull those values from the other, spreadsheet or Word document before it can decide on which other software to open. You want to make sure that you can actually automate this. So if there's a lot of nested dependencies in the softwares that you'll be working with, it might not be a good candidate for automation. There are some repetitive processes that really just need to be executed by people, and that's okay. But when you receive this documentation, what you're really checking for is to make sure this is something that can be automated. And process fitness and automation complexity are two of the things that you'll need to check for to make sure you can automate it. So this is what happens in the whole RPA process. Typically, RPA developers don't come in until this last kind of blocked off section of this, but these 6 steps are what make up the whole RPA process. We have the first 3 where that documentation is developed. Usually that's handled by, again, project managers, stakeholders, maybe some solution engineers, and every now and then the RPA developers will be brought into that phase. But typically RPA development doesn't come in until these last 3 steps, where you're actually developing the bots and doing some unit testing. Then you'll need to do integration testing and user acceptance testing. And then you can finally deploy the bot and have that automation run in either attended mode, where there's a person that comes in and triggers it to run, or in unattended mode, where the bot is just maybe on a timer or it's always listening for certain values to be updated. But these are the steps that go into creating an RPA bot. It's actually a pretty involved process, and all of that testing is very important, because the last thing you want is an automated bot moving files around and changing data in inconsistent ways that you can't figure out. So we have to do all of that testing long before we say, yes, it's okay to start using this bot for that automation. So we'll quickly run through these steps. With discovery and project kickoff, this is where hopefully maybe you'll be brought in, where they're going through the process of figuring out what should be automated, kind of finding those steps that need to be taken, and doing a lot of documentation. So what files do need to be opened? What data does need to be extracted? Where does it need to be put? These are some of the questions that get brought up in that discovery and project kickoff phase. Then next we have the process analysis phase. This is definitely where they should loop you in as the RPA developer, where you actually have that process definition document and maybe the object model diagram to look through the flow and see if it meets those standards of process fitness and automation complexity so that you can give them accurate feedback on whether or not this is a process that can be automated. And then finally, we come up with that solution design where we figured out what the bot should do. We know all the steps it should take. We know what fields and what data types to expect. And we can just really fine-tune all of our documentation so far so that once we're done with the solution design, you can start just building this bot. As you build this bot, you'll want to write some test cases and make sure that it's doing things the way you expect. Because, again, the last thing you want is a bot to get deployed to production and it's moving around all these important files and data, but it's not working the way that it should. So while you're developing the bot, make sure you test the bot. Then we get to integration testing and user acceptance testing. So integration testing is when we run the entire process from end to end. That would be opening the email, getting the attachment, getting those values, and putting them wherever they need to go, making sure that that's working correctly. And then we have that user acceptance testing where one of the people who currently do this task actually watches the bot and sees if it goes through the steps as expected. So this should meet the exact outline in the process definition document, in the object model diagram. It's been discussed. It's been accepted by everyone. So this is just an extra verification step that it is working like we all expect it to. Oh. And then you deploy the bot. So when you deploy a bot, that means it's in UiPath Orchestrator, which is something we'll talk about a little bit later in this class. So next, let's just talk a little bit about how UiPath Studio, Orchestrator, and these bots work together. So Studio is like where we build bots. Orchestrator is where we publish bots, and it is also how we, orchestrate bots. We are able to determine if we want them to be attended bots, which are run through UiPath Assistant by some person. They click a button, the bot does its thing. Or it can run in unattended mode, where Orchestrator sends these pings to the bot to make sure that it's executing the processes we expect. So this is just a little diagram of what the flow looks like for Studio, Orchestrator, and all of these bots to work together. So again, UiPath Studio is probably where you'll spend the most time. It definitely is for this exam, but it's just the IDE that we use to create automation projects. So if you are familiar with programming, it's kind of like our VS Code, but specifically for RPA bots. And we are going to take a quick look at that. Let me switch my screen over.